Hello everyone. Welcome to AMH 2020, U.S. Introductory Survey since 1877. This will be the first of two videos about the United States' involvement in the Second World War, or World War II as it's commonly known in the United States. This video is going to go over the causes of World War II, the beginning of the conflict, the rise of totalitarianism in Europe and Asia, and we'll talk about what America was doing during this period in the 1920s and 1930s. And then we'll talk about the beginning of the war and the U.S.'s delayed entrance into the conflict. The U.S. does not enter World War II at the beginning, just as the U.S. did not enter World War I at the beginning. But we'll talk about the U.S. entrance to the war, why the U.S. came into the war when it did. We'll talk about Pearl Harbor, and we'll talk about assistance the United States provided to the Allies even before Pearl Harbor. We will also talk about the mobilization of the American home front, both before and after the Pearl Harbor attacks. And then we're going to talk about everyday life and domestic mobilization during the war, how the American people from a variety of backgrounds got involved in the war effort and how they were impacted by the war in both positive and negative ways. And the image on this slide is of U.S. soldiers from the 77th Infantry deployed in Okinawa, receiving news of Germany's surrender on the 8th of May, 1945. To begin, World War II greatly impacted American life and culture, and it redefined American foreign policy, turning the U.S. into an economic and military superpower. U.S. military power and economic power had been growing since the 19th century, and in many ways the U.S. had emerged into a position of significant global influence after World War I, but we're really going to emerge as the world leader after World War II. But to begin, though, we have to consider when did the U.S. enter World War II, this pivotal conflict in global history. And the U.S. officially entered the war after the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. This was a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. Relations with Japan had already been deteriorating for years before this point. Relations with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy had also been deteriorating for years before this point. But the war was on after this December 7th, 1941 attack. Congress voted almost unanimously to declare war, and the American people supported the full-scale opening of hostilities. And while the U.S. officially entered World War I in late 1941, many Americans today, I've found, do not realize that the Second World War had been going on for over 2 years before the U.S. entered the conflict, and they had been fighting across the world that would lead up to World War II as early as 1931. And I'm going to unpack this more in the coming slides. World War II officially began September the 1st, 1939, with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland. The Soviet Union, which at the time was a non-aggression pact holder and really nominal ally of Nazi Germany, invaded Poland about 2 weeks later from the east. This was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, while ideologically opposed to each other, Nazi Germany being Nazi, the Soviet Union being communist, they'd become allies because they were both interested in territorial expansion. And the Soviet Union had certain resources that Nazi Germany needed, especially oil. And many of the capitalist nations of Western Europe did not want to trade with the Soviet Union, but Germany was happy to do so. Hitler hated the Russians and he hated communism, but they were a useful ally, or I don't know, you might call them a frenemy of Germany. And you really see this in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and then in the basically the dismemberment of Poland. To go back for a bit of background, Germany had been taken over by Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. They took control of Germany in 1933. They had attempted the same thing back in the 1920s, but were defeated, and Hitler was imprisoned. That's when he wrote Mein Kampf. He was very angry at the Jewish population of Germany. He felt that they had betrayed the German people, contributing to their loss in World War I. He was very angry at communists as well, and he wanted to create National Socialism as an alternative to communism and as an alternative to capitalism. And under National Socialist leadership, under Nazi leadership, democracy was suspended in Germany in 1934, and Hitler eventually removed the less radical elements in his government in 1934 as well. Democracy was suspended with the Enabling Act of 1934. The Night of the Long Knives was the removal of the less radical supporters of Nazism. Germany is a multi-party state, or it was and is a multi-party state, and the National Socialist Party had been a small fringe party, but he managed to get the conservative and more right-leaning parties in Germany to support National Socialism as a alliance against communism. As time went on, though, Germany began to rearm itself. It began to rebuild its economy. They implemented legislation to protect German workers and to really closely centrally manage the German economy. It was not communism, but it was strong government regulations on the economy and on corporations to protect the German worker or the German people, or Volk, VOLK as they were called, even down to things like creating the Volkswagen, the people's car, to help German workers travel and get to work and things of that nature. They rearmed the country in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. They particularly rearmed the Rhineland, the western part of Germany that is on the border of France. And this was allowed to take place because other Western European countries were struggling with the Great Depression, and nobody wanted to confront Germany and possibly have another war. Things are going to get worse, though. In 1938, Germany will seize control of Austria. From what we know, the Austrian people largely supported the seizure of their country. They saw it as a unification with German-speaking friends and allies. There were some Austrian nationalists, some of the more left-leaning elements of the Austrian government and society that opposed this takeover of their country. There are even people like the Von Trapp family, the family that the Sound of Music movie is based on. They opposed the German takeover of their country for nationalist reasons. But Austria was taken over in 1938. That's actually the same year of the Night of the Broken Glass. Persecution of Jews had been increasing since the mid-1930s in Germany, and 1938 was Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, in which German Jewish businesses were attacked and destroyed. Hence, the glass of these buildings was broken. Next, Germany seized the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. This was a part of Czechoslovakia that had a large ethnic German population, and Hitler wanted to take control of this territory because he had a goal of uniting German-speaking peoples together in one country. He also wanted to try to retake as much territory that had once been part of previous German empires or Reichs. Hitler, of course, would have called his Germany the Third Reich. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which began in medieval times in the 800s and 900s. And then the Second Reich was the German Empire under Bismarck, which lasted from 1871 to 1918. And then there was Hitler's Third Reich, which began in 1933. And this idea of linking people of similar language and ethnicity and recovering former territories, it's part of a nationalist ideology, or even an ethno-nationalist, and also a somewhat imperialist ideology called irredentism. And the Italians also believed in irredentism as well, or Italian leader Benito Mussolini did, but I'll get to him soon. So the Nazis take over Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, and eventually they take over the entirety of Czechoslovakia as well. And former Entente powers, Britain and France, did not want to have another war. They had enough economic challenges and political instability, and this policy was called appeasement. And they believed that by giving Germany some of these concessions, they could avoid future wars. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously said in reference to appeasement of Germany, we will have peace in our time if we allow Germany to take control of these territories. Of course, he was wrong, and there's a sort of willful ignorance about the appeasement policy as well, in addition to internal divisions and economic problems that also enabled the appeasement stance. France and Britain do declare war on Germany after Germany invades Poland, and Germany will join into a alliance called the Pact of Steel with fascist Italy in 1939. Italy had formerly been an ally of France and Britain in World War I, but now Italy is an ally of Nazi Germany. They are both fascist nations. There's differences between Italian fascism and Nazi National Socialism. In 1939, the majority of the fighting is in Eastern Europe, in and around Poland, and many people believed, again, very naively, that perhaps this was going to be the extent of the war, and some even called it the phony war. But 1939 turns to 1940, and the fighting begins as the weather warms up, and Western Europe will fall to Nazi Germany. The Nazi military will take over Norway and Denmark in April of 1940. Then they will take over the Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in May of 1940. And then France will be overwhelmed by the Nazis by July of 1940. The French military will collapse very spectacularly, and the British expeditionary force that was in France will be defeated as well. And these campaigns in the spring and summer of 1940 will give Nazi Germany and its allies control over most of Western Europe. Britain stood alone in Western Europe, and the Nazis prepared for Operation Sea Lion, which would have been a amphibious assault and an invasion of the British Isles. But Hitler will ultimately abandon the Operation Sea Lion after the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, failed to gain air superiority in the skies over England during the Battle of Britain. This would have been July through October of 1940. The Royal Air Force, the RAF, was too strong, and the Nazis just did not have enough landing craft and assault vessels to successfully get across the English Channel and have a proper invasion of the British Isles. In addition, the Nazi military had allowed what was left of the British expeditionary force to escape back to Britain as well. So Operation Sea Lion ends up being a non-starter. Here are some images related to the rise of Hitler, the rise of Nazism, the spread of Nazism throughout Germany, and then the Nazi annexation of Austria, and eventually of the Sudetenland in brown on the bottom right map, and then eventually the rest of Czechoslovakia as well. And of course, World War II officially begins with the invasion of Poland in 1939. In response to the economic privations that came after World War I, thanks to demobilization of militaries, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, totalitarian ideologies rose up in Europe. The economic problems that the Weimar Republic endured, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, they facilitated Hitler's rise to power. And something similar happened with Benito Mussolini in the 1920s. Remember, Hitler tried to take control of Germany in the 20s, but failed. In 1922, Benito Mussolini gains power in Italy. Mussolini, as a young man, had been a socialist. He came from a very socialistic family, but his political ideology changed with time, and he adopted fascism, which is more corporatistic, It involves regulation of the economy by the government, but the government partners very closely with corporations, and corporations kind of serve the government in a fascist system. Um, there are many similarities between Italian fascism and between Nazism or National Socialism, but there are some key differences as well. Historians and philosophers and political scientists generally classify Italian fascism, Nazism, Francoist nationalism that you see in Spain, and other types of, you could say, authoritarian ideologies, political ideologies within the general umbrella of fascism. We often think of these ideologies as being right wing. In some ways they are, in some ways they're left wing as well, because there's a lot of effort to centrally manage the economy. There's a lot of moves for things like labor unions and for workers' rights. It's very complex. Just as there's many different types of communism, there's different types of fascism as well. Some of these fascistic ideologies are more supportive of religion. Spanish Francoist nationalism, a type of fascism, was very supportive of the Catholic Church, whereas Hitler's Nazism was much more opposed to Christianity. While many Germans were Christians, and they had to, the Nazis promised that they were going to support the religion by going after the Jews. Hitler himself was not a Christian. He was actually very opposed to Christianity. He left the faith, the Christian faith, the Catholic faith specifically, at a very young age, and he was much more interested in other religions. He had interest in Islam, for example. He also had an interest in the occult too. So the point is, there's some variety within these fascistic and ethno-nationalist and authoritarian ideologies, which is why Italian fascism, Nazism, and things like Spanish nationalism are considered to be within the larger fascist ideology, even if they do have some considerable differences. The big similarities, though, are totalitarianism, strongmen leaders, whether it's the Führer Hitler, Il Duce Mussolini, or Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain. There is a strong sense of militarism that exists in all of these ideologies. There is a central management of the economy as well. And there is a very militaristic and strong sense of nationalism, what you might call ultra-nationalism. Ultra-nationalism meaning that your nation and your people are better than everyone else, and they ought to use force to grow their power. And there often is a ethnic or a racial component to this ethnocentric ultranationalism. For the Germans, it was the Aryan German race. For the Italians, they believed that the Italians were better. You see it to some degree with the Spanish as well, with Francoists in Spain as well. And Italian fascism and Spanish nationalism don't necessarily have to be anti-Semitic the way Nazism was, but they do become more anti-Semitic with time as a result of their alliance with Hitler and the Nazis. But when we're talking about Italian fascism and territorial aggrandizement, Il Duce Mussolini really wanted to recreate the glory of the Roman Empire. I showed images related to that actually in a previous video on my video about the Great Depression, and he wanted to expand the Italian Empire in Africa, move away from the colonies in Somaliland, what is now Somalia, and retake control of Ethiopia, or rather, take control of Ethiopia. You see this in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. 1935 to 1936, the Italian military used machine guns, poison gas, and aircraft to overwhelm the Ethiopian military. The monarch of Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, he petitioned the world to help retake his country. He went to the League of Nations and asked for help, and they declined to help him. Italy also wanted to expand its territory in the Balkans, again, trying to recreate the glory and the power of the Roman Empire. This is also an irredentist ideology of retaking territory that had once been part of the Roman Empire and bringing it into the fascist Italian Empire. Here are scenes related to the 1940 fighting in the spring and summer of that year. Initially, people hoped, perhaps naively, that the fighting would just be in Eastern Europe, and it would be a phony war, or Sitzkrieg, they called it. Instead of Blitzkrieg or lightning war, they thought it would be Sitzkrieg, and that fighting would be much slower in Western Europe. And the French strategy really relied on this. Again, perhaps naively, perhaps there was a bit of willful ignorance here as well, but France also had really serious economic problems, and France was very politically divided between right-wing and left-wing political movements. France also had a multi-party system like Germany did, and that leads to a lot of political instability. But the French military was probably over-relying on a line of defenses called the Maginot Line that were in place around the German and French border. These fortifications were designed to stop tanks and to prevent Germany from rolling into France. Um, French military theorists thought it might be a possibility that Germany might try to recreate their success in World War I, invading through Belgium, Schlieffen Plan 2.0. But what Hitler and the Nazis did was far larger and more ambitious. Not only do they invade Belgium, they will invade the Netherlands and Luxembourg as well, which gives the German ground-based military, the Wehrmacht, a lot more flexibility than they would have had in World War I. They can have a much more expansive front as well, which that's going to prevent the slow trench warfare of World War I. In addition, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is able to take advantage of new aircraft technology that's much more powerful than anything that was available in World War I. And basically, the French military, they thought it was going to be just like World War I. They thought they could slow the Nazis down. Instead, the Nazis went through Belgium and through the Netherlands. They also went through the Ardennes forest, which is between the Maginot Line and between the flat topography of Belgium. French military officers, they believed erroneously that the Ardennes forest was too rugged for tanks, and Germans had very good tanks. The French actually had good tanks as well, but they spread their tanks out across their entire line of defense rather than collecting them together to punch through enemy positions, blitzkrieg style, which the best tank officers in World War I, like George Patton, had realized that tanks were best used when they were put together to force through the enemy lines rather than being spread out to support the infantry. And the Nazis did this very well with their blitzkrieg, and the French did not anticipate blitzkrieg nearly as well as they could have or should have, and that leads to the French military basically collapsing in not even 2 months. And what the German tanks and trucks will do is, with the help of the Air Force, they will capture key bridges, and they will capture railheads and strategic areas where junctions of roads come together, and then you move up your slower moving ground pounding infantry. And Hitler and the Nazis, they will invade and capture Paris, as you can see here. Once the Nazis captured Paris, they in French territory, they begin to remove artwork and valuable commodities and items and things like that. And they're going to set up a occupied France in the northern half of the country, and then the southern portion of the country will be turned into a fascist collaborative state called Vichy France, Vichy. And as I mentioned before, the British Expeditionary Force and some of the remaining French army, they're going to escape at Dunkirk, the miracle of Dunkirk, as it's often called. The Hitler and the Nazis, they potentially could have trapped the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, but the Nazis had extended themselves so quickly they needed to refuel and regroup. And also Hermann Göring of the Luftwaffe, he wanted to bomb the British at Dunkirk, and so there were delays, and that gave the British Expeditionary Force the opportunity to escape and retreat back to Britain. That was Operation Dynamo, in which the British Navy and British civilian vessels rescued the British at Dunkirk and brought them back to Britain, which that made Operation Sea Lion much more of a non-starter, having a large British force back to defend their homeland. In addition, the Luftwaffe struggled against the RAF. And while they did heavily damage British cities like London during what was called the Blitz, they were not able to demoralize the British people the way they'd hoped with the Battle of Britain. If anything, their attacks on British cities only strengthened the resolve of the American people. We shall never surrender. We shall fight them on the beaches, as Prime Minister Winston Churchill said. We've already discussed the rise of totalitarianism in Italy, and we talked a bit about the Russian Revolution in a previous video. So um, we'll talk a bit more about how the Soviet Union became more totalitarian in the 1920s and 1930s. Joseph Stalin came to power in 1922, the same year actually that Mussolini came to power in Italy. And as time went on, Stalin consolidated his power, especially after Lenin died in 1924. He eliminated his political rivals, having them assassinated, most notably people like Leon Trotsky, who Stalin actually had assassinated even though he'd fled the country and was actually living in Mexico. Um, Towards the end of his life, Lenin had become a bit less authoritarian, and he was actually moving towards allowing some free market reforms back into the Soviet Union. That way, the country would be more economically productive. But he ended up being very ill and dying by 1924. And Stalin was he was a communist. He was committed to the communist ideology. He had some different ideas than Lenin, or a Marxist-Leninist. That's often what Lenin's ideology is called, Marxist-Leninism. But under Stalin, things became even more authoritarian and more totalitarian. There were still millions of deaths during Lenin's rule, both from political persecution and from policy failures. But Stalin is going to bring in a much more aggressive and totalitarian form of communism to the Soviet Union. And you really see this in what were called the dekulakization campaigns in what is now the Ukraine. The kulaks were basically a Ukrainian ethnic group. They were former peasants who had begun to acquire some wealth. They'd begun to acquire land and livestock and plows, and they were an important part of Ukraine and of feeding Russia. But Stalin's plan was to collectivize agriculture, to remove the kulak farms and replace them with large collective state-run farms. And the dekulakization of Ukraine actually had been happening even before the rule of Joseph Stalin, but it intensified under Stalin's rule, particularly from about 1929 to about 1932. And hundreds of thousands of people were forced off of their land, ethnically cleansed, you might say, and executed, and then millions more people died from starvation as a result of this agricultural class of people being declared class enemies and their system being replaced with communist collective farming. So totalitarianism is on the rise in the Soviet Union, particularly under Joseph Stalin. Stalin also had some irredentist ideas as well. You see this in the Winter War against Finland that took place from 1939 to 1940. Finland had been signed over to Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended the Russian involvement in World War I. And Stalin wanted this territory back, even though the Finns were their own ethnic group with a very different culture and different ethnic traditions than the Russians. This country had been once a part of Russia, the Russian Empire, given away by the Soviet Union as part of a treaty, but Stalin wanted it back, and Finland was taken over by the Nazis, by the communists of the Soviet Union. Eventually, the Finns actually will become allies of the Nazis in order to fight against the Soviets that have taken over their country. But they will use ski patrols and reindeer to try to fight Soviet tanks. And finally, there was a really brutal civil war in Spain. It's the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, in which the fascist aligned nationalist faction led by Francisco Franco took control of the country with military assistance, especially from Italy, but also from Germany. The Soviet Union and Mexico, actually, they backed the losing left-wing Republican side. This is Francisco Franco. He is the dictator of Spain, the leader of the victorious nationalist faction in the Spanish Civil War. Spanish nationalism under Franco, or Francoist nationalism, it's generally considered to be under the larger fascist umbrella alongside Italian fascism and Nazism, but there are some differences between Spanish nationalism and Italian fascism and Nazism. Similarities would be authoritarianism or totalitarianism, led by dictator strongmen, whether it's Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, or Franco in Spain. Militarism certainly is a feature of Spanish nationalism, as it is for Italian fascism and for Nazism. You can definitely see that in this image of Franco in a military uniform. There is a degree of ethnocentrism to Spanish nationalism, that the Spanish people are the best and above others. I would say that ethnocentric sentiment is not quite as strong in Spanish nationalism as it is in Italian fascism or in Nazism. There is an interest in not only a militaristic culture, but a traditionalistic culture. Hitler had the German people, the German Volk, and trying to recreate the German empires of old. Mussolini was interested in recreating the ancient Roman Empire, and Franco wanted to reintroduce more traditionalistic elements of Spanish society, most notably the Catholic Church, which had been, I would say, suppressed by the left-wing Republican political parties that had ruled the Spanish nation before Franco took over. Also, the Spanish monarchy too. Franco supported the Catholic Church and the Spanish monarchy, which were traditional institutions in Spanish society that had been suppressed by the left-wing socialist, Republican political factions that had ruled the country prior to 1936. And that was what began the Spanish Civil War. Was more conservative parties in Spain did not like the direction the country was going in under the left-wing Republican government. There was a lot of chaos. There was some suppression as well going on, particularly of the Catholic Church and other elements of traditional Spanish culture, and that gave some of the more rural cultures in Spain a desire to rise up. Also, many elements of the military did not like the direction the country was going in, and Franco had significant support from fascist Italy and from Nazi Germany. The Republican left-wing coalition had support from the Soviet Union and from Mexico, and a little bit of tacit support from Britain and France. There were also Americans that went and fought in Spanish Republican military units as well. But in the end, the nationalists had more support, and they won this war. And you really, in some ways, you can think of the Spanish Civil War as almost a dress rehearsal for World War II in terms of the military technology that you see used, especially the strategic bombing of cities. On this image, you see the bombing of the city of Guernica, which was largely destroyed during the Spanish Civil War. Other cities like Barcelona were also bombed as well. And some of this artwork and the general chaos and violence and destruction of the period, it inspired Pablo Picasso's art, particularly his destruction of Guernica abstract piece that you see on the bottom of this slide. And the last thing I want to say is there was a lot of chaos during the period of left-wing rule of Spain. This is largely because the left-wing factions of the Spanish Republic, they were not all the same. They were not a monolith. There were socialists, there were communists, there were groups of people called syndicalists, Syndicalists. The syndicalists were radical unions that wanted to have a revolution through the use of unions. It's a little bit different than socialism or communism, but in the end, of course, the nationalists who supported traditional institutions like the Catholic Church and the monarchy with significant foreign support are able to win the Spanish Civil War and take control of the country. And Spain will officially be neutral in World War II, but there were Spaniards who will serve in international units in the Wehrmacht, and Spain will allow German U-boats to stop and resupply, and German agents will be active in Spain, and to a certain degree, Spain will participate in Nazi racial policies, especially towards Jews. We will now turn our attention to the growth of totalitarian regimes in Asia. In the Pacific, Japan had been an ally in the Entente powers alongside Britain, France, the United States, and Russia as well, even though the relationship was very tense. But the Japanese wanted to build an Asian empire to rival the empires of the US and of the old European powers. They're going to expand their territory in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and they do so during the Russo-Japanese War, and they sided with the Entente in World War I because it was an opportunity for additional territorial expansion. Military culture has long been an important part of Japanese society, but Japan rapidly militarized during the Meiji Restoration, during the period of Emperor Meiji from about 1868 to about 1889. And in this period, the Japanese military expanded, it modernized, in some ways it westernized as well, as the Japanese are also trying to build their a foreign empire beyond the Japanese home islands. Really, Japan changes very quickly in a very brief period of time. It went from being a small, isolated island nation to a Pacific empire in really just a few decades. There's a phenomenon that I think is at work in Japan. Sometimes it's called cultural lag, other times it's called social lag, where technology changes very quickly, especially military technology, but social beliefs and social norms and cultural norms, they take much longer to change. But social lag, I think, is something you really see in Japan in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it's going to contribute to the Japanese militaristic, nationalistic, imperialistic ideology. You remember, though, the Russo-Japanese War that happens in the early 1900s. That was a Japanese victory against Russia. The peace was negotiated by the United States. Some Japanese felt that America negotiated a treaty that was too favorable to the losing side, to Russia, and historians have argued that the anger over this treaty, it contributed to the weakening of the emperor's rule and the strengthening of the military's rule, and that ultimately that's going to allow the Japanese military to basically take control of the Japanese government and turn the emperor, who was a very important figure to the Japanese people, basically a god, a divine figure, into really just a puppet, symbolic ruler. The Japanese people supported him, you might even say worshipped him, but he didn't have much actual political power. And we would say by about 1930 or 1931, the end of the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s, this Japanese military cabal had consolidated their power, and they were the ones really ruling Japan, to the point that the Japanese, at the behest of the military, will invade Manchuria by 1931. They will change its name to Manchukuo, and then they will invade the rest of China by 1937. And their plan is to gain the natural resources of China. China was in the midst of a really brutal civil war in this period between the communists and the nationalists, so China was in a weak position. Japan wanted those resources. Some historians have argued that the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, in which the United States increased its tariffs in an attempt to be more protectionist, that contributed to the Japanese decision to invade Manchuria because they needed a place to sell their manufactured goods and they needed to gain access to the natural resources of Manchuria, especially iron and coal, things that Japan needed to build its military. They will continue their expansion, though, into the rest of China by 1937. And Japanese military imperialism or military nationalism, it contains many of the hallmark traits of fascism. It contains a strong militarist sentiment, authoritarianism, not through a single individual, but through that military junta that's ruling the country. Traditionalism as well. Even though Japanese country was changing quite a bit, there still was a lot of reverence for the emperor, reverence for the Bushido code of the Japanese military cultural tradition. So there's a traditionalism like what you see in Nazi Germany and in um, fascist Italy and in nationalist Spain. And there is a belief in ethnic superiority of the Japanese or Yamato people, that they are better than everyone else and even better than other Asian people, better than the Chinese, better than the Vietnamese, better than the Koreans, even better than people of Japanese ancestry who were born outside of Japan. They're known as Nisei. And you see this attitude in the building of the Japanese empire, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It's an empire that promises to be anti-imperialistic, but there's very little co-prosperity going on. The Japanese are taking these resources out of these countries, and they are in some cases committing really horrific atrocities against the peoples of these countries. You see this especially in things like the mass killing and mass SA of Chinese people and Chinese women, particularly at Nanking. And the Japanese, one of the reasons why they were so angry and why they were trying to build this empire was because they believed that the U.S. and the European powers had disrespected them and looked on them as junior partners. This goes back all the way to the Russo-Japanese War. They didn't get the territorial concessions they wanted. It goes back to American bans on Japanese immigration. Japan also banned American immigration as well. It goes back to the 1920s, restrictions on Japanese naval construction. The British and the Americans could build more ships than the Japanese were allowed to. So there were reasons that they had to be angry, but that doesn't mean that building this empire, violating other cultures' self-determination, and then atrocities against these people doesn't mean that that's right either. But in 1940, Japan joins the Axis powers, and then it will invade French Indochina, which is now Vietnam. They will do that in 1940 and 1941. Technically, French Indochina, now Vietnam, it was ruled by the Vichy French collaborationist fascist French government that was in southern France, but um, Germany allowed Japan to invade Indochina and to take over the country. That way they could have access to the natural resources of Indochina, things like agriculture, rice, and rubber, things that the Japanese military and the Japanese empire needed if it was going to grow and consolidate its power. And controlling Indochina, that's going to threaten the Dutch territories of Indonesia, Dutch Indonesia, and it's going to threaten British India and British territorial holdings in Southeast Asia as well, like Burma, for example. Unlike Indochina, which was ruled by a collaborationist French government that was collaborating with the Nazis and accepted the Japanese invasion, Dutch Indonesia remained loyal to the legitimate Dutch government in exile. So the Japanese will have a harder time gaining control of Dutch Indonesia. These are some images related to the Japanese expansion in the Pacific in the 1930s. At the center, we have Hideki Tojo, Japanese military leader. He is the sort of, you might say, the Hitler of the Japanese military cabal. There isn't as much of a central leader in the Japanese government, in the Japanese totalitarian model, the way you have like Hitler in Germany or Mussolini in Italy. The closest you would have, I guess, in this case is Tojo. Um, on the right-hand side is Emperor Hirohito, who really had very little political power. He had influence, and he was revered by the Japanese people, but it was the military that controlled the country. He wasn't completely powerless, though, and I'll get into what power Hirohito had actually later in this video. But the other scenes on this slide are of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, where the Japanese thought the Chinese were beneath them. They engaged in what we would call war crimes against prisoners of war and against Chinese civilians, and this was done in other parts of the Japanese territorial expansion as well. So what was going on in America during this period? From the 1920s, after World War I, the U.S. had begun to take on a more non-interventionist stance in world affairs. We're not truly isolationist, but we're moving towards a more non-interventionist foreign policy, a less militaristic, less jingoistic foreign policy as well. And this sentiment is really going to intensify in the 1930s as well, because America was dealing with the Great Depression. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to focus government spending on the New Deal rather than on the military and foreign policy. He even wanted to really gut the military's size and budget, which really angered people like Douglas MacArthur, a military officer and chief of staff who also opposed FDR on political grounds. MacArthur was more politically conservative than FDR was as well. And some of the more left-leaning elements in FDR's cabinet, they regarded U.S. foreign policy of any kind as being too imperialistic. So there was much more of a focus on domestic issues in the 1920s and 1930s. The conservatives of the 20s wanted to save money and focus on internal affairs, and the more liberal government of the 1930s also wanted to focus on internal affairs and focus government spending on the New Deal. The American economy was struggling during the Great Depression. It took us a lot longer to get out of the Depression. I argued it wasn't really until 1942 that we fully get out of the Great Depression. And people on, I would say, the more extreme sides of American politics, extreme right and left, they favor some of these more isolationist-leaning policies. And there was quite a bit of concern about joining World War II. Even from the beginning, I would suggest things like Dalton Trumbo. He was a left-wing anti-war supporter. He wrote a book called Johnny Got His Gun that came out in 1939 that was about the horrors of World War I. It was written to discourage America from adopting a more aggressive foreign policy that would challenge Germany. It comes out right as Germany is invading Poland. Trumbo, though, was on the pretty extreme left. He was a communist sympathizer. And on the extreme right, you have people like Charles Lindbergh, who had a interest in Nazi Germany and worked hard to try to keep America out of World War II, because he was a supporter of Nazi Germany. Henry Ford, who was a pacifist and an anti-Semite, also opposed the U.S. Entrance into World War I, although Ford does eventually provide a lot of military supply and materiel during the war once the U.S. Begins to get involved. So further to the south in Latin America, FDR, he supported the Good Neighbor policy of 1934, which this fully reversed the Roosevelt corollary. Again, America had been getting out of its Latin American intervention since the 20s, but now it's going to be a policy that the Roosevelt corollary, the interventions in Latin America to stop supposed European expansion, they're going to end, and the United States is not going to intervene in Latin America. And this is done to promote more even, more equal relationships with our Latin American neighbors, and to allow the resources that were going to these interventions to be focused on domestic issues. The idea is Pan-American unity, move away from jingoism, and change the relationship between the U.S. and Latin American nations into more of an equal partnership. And it was successful. Latin American nations supported the good neighbor policy. They liked being in a more equal relationship rather than in a relationship of subordination as they'd been put into in the earlier decades. Here is the good neighbor policy. Have more of a balanced and understanding relationship with our Latin American neighbors. And here's an image of FDR meeting with Latin American politicians. This is specifically a meeting that took place in Brazil. So I want to talk about public opinion of the violence that's going on in Europe and in Asia. The American people are witnessing these conflicts, and at first, America is much more focused on dealing with domestic issues. We're not completely isolationist, but we are moving in a more isolationist direction. The thing is, public opinion, though, is more on the side of the Allies, most especially Britain and France. Public opinion is turning against Germany and it's turning against Japan, and we don't like Italy or Russia very much either. Anti-Italian sentiment is strong in America. There is anti-Asian sentiment against the Japanese, and there's anti-communist sentiment against Russia and the Soviet Union. And word of the totalitarian actions and oppressive actions of these nation states is becoming increasingly well known in the United States. As the war begins in 1939 and 1940, President Roosevelt recognized the war was an opportunity to strengthen the American economy and provide support to the Allies. Again, Roosevelt is a pragmatist, and Roosevelt recognized this as an opportunity to bolster American manufacturing and turn the U.S. into the arsenal of democracy by providing equipment to the Allies, especially to Great Britain. Roosevelt gave a speech in 1940 called the Arsenal of Democracy speech, in which he called for the United States to support the Allies against Nazi Germany and to stop German totalitarianism and territorial expansion. Britain will receive aid from the United States, and then this arsenal of democracy this policy will be extended with the Lend-Lease Act of 1940. This will involve basically leases on military arms and materiel that will be sent to first to Britain and then eventually to the Soviet Union. But it starts with Britain. There will be 99-year leases on this equipment. Essentially, we're going to be giving this equipment to our allies for permanent use, because we're not going to want a 99-year-old tank back or a 99-year-old firearm back. But the idea is we're offering this equipment at a low price and for basically permanent use to our allies. After June of 1941, Nazi Germany will invade the Soviet Union. Hitler moves on from his invasion of Britain and instead focuses on Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Soviets will receive Lend-Lease aid as well. In fact, about 20% of the tanks that the United States made during World War II will actually go to the Soviet Union, because tanks were absolutely essential for the war effort in the wide open battlefields of Eastern Europe. And Soviet generals, most notably Marshal Zhukov, said that without this Lend-Lease aid supplied by the capitalist American economy, the Soviet Union would have had a much more difficult time defeating Nazi Germany. It was Russian blood and American steel, as Stalin said. In addition to arming our allies, Roosevelt will also oversee the institution of the first peacetime draft in American history. This is in 1940 as well. France had fallen so rapidly, and it was clear that not only were we going to need to supply equipment to the Allies, we were going to need to be potentially ready to go to war as well. We've had drafts before in American history, before 1940, but they were very controversial. This is the first time we've had a true national peacetime draft, though. And Roosevelt was a pragmatist. He had multiple goals for supporting the Allies. One, it's to stop the expansion of Nazi Germany to stop the spread of totalitarianism. But it's also, this will jumpstart the American economy. It'll create jobs. It'll help to get Americans back to work. And a peacetime draft as well is going to remove young young men from the workforce, put them into the military. It's going to open up jobs for older men, and it's going to lower the unemployment rate. As FDR would have said, Dr. New Deal is struggling, but Dr. Win the War is going to pick up the torch. Here are some images associated with Lend-Lease, the Arsenal of Democracy, and the Peacetime Draft, and Dr. New Deal and Dr. Win the War. Here you see FDR driving a new Jeep. He's saying, "Turn her out to pasture, boys. We've got to get going." Meanwhile, his cabinet, most notably Vice President Henry Wallace, you see here, they're riding on an old, beat-up scalawag of a horse. That's an old term for an old horse. They're saying, "Oh, the old great mare, she ain't what she used to be." Whereas FDR is a bit more pragmatic. He sees areas where the New Deal is struggling, but preparing for war is an opportunity to really supercharge the American economy. In a peacetime draft, will remove young men from the labor force and put them into the military, making way for other men to take those jobs behind. And this draft was not only for white men, it was for black men as well. And cities like Detroit, which had been hit very hard by the Depression, they're going to have many new jobs available, and there's going to be a lot of economic prosperity that's going to come into cities like Detroit, and that's going to last until after World War II. That prosperity, though, as you know, will not last forever. While the American public supports the Allies and they want to send supplies and things like that to help Britain and eventually to help the Soviet Union. FDR needs to prepare the American people and inform them of the dangers of Nazism and of these totalitarian ideologies. So, in January of 1941, in his annual message, his State of the Union, what we would call it today, he talks about the four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And this is a clear criticism of the totalitarian regimes of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. It's also a criticism of the Soviet Union as well. We're not supplying the Soviet Union just yet. We're not going to start supplying the Soviet Union until the summer of 1941 after Germany invades the Soviet Union. But we associate the four freedoms with the artwork of Norman Rockwell, very famous American social realist artist. Freedom of speech. Even a working class man should be able to express his opinion in America. Freedom of worship for the many different confessional groups, Protestants, Catholics, Jews in America. Religion was suppressed in Nazi Germany especially, and the Soviet Union as well. Freedom from want, sort of an endorsement of FDR's New Deal policies, and definitely a criticism of the collectivized farming of the Soviet Union, which was causing a lot of want, in fact, famines and starvation. And then freedom from fear, freedom from the totalitarian repression that was happening as a result of the German and Japanese invasions, but also happening domestically within Germany and within the Soviet Union. As I said before, the average American did not want to militarily enter the war in 1941. There is some bloodshed, though, before World War II, before the United States officially enters World War II. An American ship was attacked by the Japanese in 1937 during their operations in China. Japan apologized for this and smoothed things over, but relations with the Japanese are going to get worse. The United States is shipping supplies to Britain via the Lend-Lease program, and the German U-boats begin to sink ships that are carrying supplies. This threatens American lives, and American destroyers actually begin to escort civilian vessels that are carrying supplies to Britain and eventually to the Soviet Union. And They're not supposed to attack German U-boats, but they are supposed to defend if a German U-boat does attack. This is the battle for the Atlantic, and really it begins before the U.S. Enters the war officially. And Americans were coming around to the idea that the U.S. was going to eventually enter the war, but there was no hurry for this to happen. Public opinion done by pollsters and polling firms shows that Americans, as time went on, became more supportive of the idea of entering the war. And some of these polling firms were actually operated by the British. And some historians have suggested that these polls were not so much about gauging American public opinion as they were about manufacturing public opinion by showing Americans that their fellow citizens supported the war, and that would make more and more Americans want to come around to militarily supporting the war, because, of course, Britain will want the United States to enter the war militarily. Things change as time goes on. The United States begins a series of embargoes against Japan as a result of their military expansions. We will not sell them things like oil and iron and coal, essential materials they need to build their empire. And Japan will basically break off diplomatic relations with the United States as a result of these embargoes. And when Japan does eventually attack Americans and spill the blood of American citizens at Pearl Harbor, all of this changed. The American public is now very supportive of the war effort. On the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see a German U-boat. The Germans were leaders in submarine technology or U-boat technology. The technology has significantly improved since World War I. The Germans will even develop technologies like the schnorkel, or basically it's a snorkel. The snorkel allows the submarine to have access to air. To basically its engines will have air when they are under the water, not at a very deep depth, but like a shallow depth, like a snorkel that you use when you're swimming. That's why it's called that. But the German over the seas navy, or the Kriegsmarine is what the German navy is called, they were not nearly as powerful as the British or the American navy in terms of battleships, destroyers, or aircraft carriers, but they were definitely very strong U-boat power, just as they had been in World War I. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see U.S. Marines that were deployed in Iceland. Um, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway not just for their natural resources, but because they had territories in the Atlantic. Iceland was in a union with Norway at this point in history, and to take over Norway could lead to the takeover of Iceland, which would have been a very strategic holding for Hitler and the Nazis. They could have launched U-boat and aircraft raids from Iceland. And Denmark actually controlled Greenland as a territory. They still control Greenland as of 2025, but if Hitler could have taken control of Iceland and Greenland, that would have been very threatening to the United States. That doesn't happen, though, because um, Hitler's not able to get Iceland. Iceland is occupied by the British, and eventually the British will withdraw from Iceland, and the United States will take over the occupation of Iceland. The evidence we have, though, suggests that the Icelandic people did not support the Nazis. This is the Atlantic Charter. It was an agreement made between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It was made in the summer of 1941. It's actually pretty similar to Wilson's 14 points, but it's distilled down to 8 points, and that is um, as the Allies fight the Axis and as they hopefully eventually defeat the Axis, there will be no opportunistic territorial seizure. Rather, there will instead be self-determination for peoples that are liberated from the Axis powers. There will be a return to self-government. Those countries will be able to rule themselves. There will be free global trade, something that the United States has wanted since the time of World War I. It's good for the American economy. There will be economic collaboration as part of this trade to improve living standards, to raise up impoverished and developing countries. And there will be freedom from fear and want, which is part of raising economic standards, freedom of the seas. Countries will be able to travel across the seas and trade freely. And then the aggressors, most notably Germany, Japan, and Italy, they will be disarmed. And some of these goals you're going to see in the formation of the United Nations after World War II as well. Now we'll talk about Pearl Harbor and the official U.S. declaration of war and military entrance into World War II. Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, according to President FDR. At about 8 a.m., the Japanese Navy, in a surprise assault, attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had not declared war on the United States, but relations between America and Japan had been deteriorating for many years. The U.S. had declined to sell aviation fuel to Japan in 1940, and we were also refusing to sell other raw materials like iron and coal. And the Japanese military high command saw these as provocations, and these were essential resources the Japanese were going to need in order to continue growing their empire and consolidate their power. And for many years, the Japanese felt they'd been disrespected by the U.S. and by Great Britain. Um, and there were reasons for them to feel this way. I'm not justifying Japanese imperialism. The Japanese naval strategists hoped that a powerful first strike against the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, while a risky move, it would defeat American naval power in the Pacific, and it would give Japan a free hand, at least temporarily, to expand and consolidate its empire in Southeast Asia. And the attack on Pearl Harbor was deadly. There were over 2,400 American military and civilian casualties. 4 American battleships were sunk, including the USS Arizona, and several other vessels were damaged. But our 3 aircraft carriers, the most important targets for the Japanese, they were not at Pearl Harbor. They had left before the attack. Um, they were on other missions throughout the Pacific. One of the vessels, the Saratoga, was actually back on the West Coast being refitted and repaired, and they were not able to sink these vessels. And aircraft carriers are the most important naval vessels in World War II because of the power of air power. You know, Billy Mitchell back in the 1920s had shown that aircraft carriers were the future of naval warfare. Um, a few airplanes launched from a carrier could sink even the most powerful battleships long before the battleship's artillery had gotten to be in range of an aircraft carrier. So in some ways, battleships were partially obsolete. They weren't useless, but they were not the future, they were the past. In addition to having to get the aircraft carriers, which the Japanese failed to do, they also needed to destroy the U.S. naval base. They needed to destroy our oil supplies, our shipyards, our repair facilities. That way Pearl Harbor couldn't be used. What was left of the U.S. Navy instead, it would have to go back to the West Coast, to Long Beach or to San Diego, and then sail out back into the Pacific. And that's about a 2,400 mile distance from Hawaii to the California coast. They don't do that. Pearl Harbor was still useful and usable as a naval facility. So essentially, Japan's gamble failed. Now the United States has entered the war, and they didn't destroy the American aircraft carriers. And you really see this in the remarks of Admiral Yamamoto, who led this assault. He initially wanted to avoid war with the United States, seeing the power of the American economy and the large American population. But he'd come around to the idea of supporting this attack because it was a gambler's move, it was a haymaker punch. But he said that doing this, it was going to be like waking up a sleeping enemy. That's what some sources say that he said about this attack, and that's exactly what happened. This is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He commanded the Japanese naval assault on Pearl Harbor, as you can see from the images on this slide. And American media in recent years has cast him as a sympathetic, tragic figure, a reluctant enemy, which in some ways he was. A man who had reservations about this sneak attack against the United States, and a man who was following orders, doing his duty for his country. You know, showing discipline and bravery worthy of a better cause, you might say. But that was not how Americans saw Admiral Yamamoto during World War II. They hated him and wanted to take him out. And that's exactly what happened. His plane was shot down in 1943, and it was called Operation Vengeance. He was shot down over Bougainville Island in 1943. The U.S. has some initial struggles in the Pacific. The United States also loses Guam and Wake Island in December of 1941. The United States was really reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, there are coordinated assaults on the British colony of Hong Kong and on Dutch Indonesia and on the American protectorate in the Philippines. And the U.S. military and its Filipino allies, they will fight against Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, who was in command of the military forces in the Philippines, he'd been calling for additional resources to be given to the Philippines for many, many years because he thought a invasion was coming. The Philippines are a very strategic island archipelago. If you want to sail between the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, you want to control the Philippines. And MacArthur made some tactical mistakes. He allowed too much of his aircraft and supply resources to be destroyed by the Japanese. And ultimately, in March of 1942, he was forced to retreat from the islands. But he promised, "I shall return." And people have criticized MacArthur's handling of the fight in the Philippines. Um, and some have said that he made tactical mistakes. Others said he left too early. But the U.S. and Filipino forces, they hung on for as long as they could, enduring really awful conditions as they were starving to death and dying of disease, trapped by the Japanese. But in the end, about 80,000 American and Filipino troops were left behind to be prisoners of war, and they were treated really awfully by the Japanese forces. You see this in the Bataan Death March, in which somewhere between 6,000 and 18,000 POWs, American and Filipino, died as a result of Japanese brutality and neglect. The Japanese Bushido military code held that it was shameful to surrender and to become a prisoner of war. And the Japanese had serious supply issues themselves, so um, prisoners of war were often very, very brutally mistreated and neglected by the Japanese. And here are images of the Japanese invasion of the Philippines and the Bataan Death March. And there was a insurgency of Filipinos as well as some Americans that had managed to escape that was going to fight the Japanese occupation for years. But American civilians living in the Philippines were also sent to prison camps and treated very badly as well during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. That's another reason why MacArthur and the United States will put a lot of energy and manpower into recapturing the Philippines. It wasn't just about MacArthur keeping good to his promise. It was about liberating American POWs and liberating American civilians that were being held in camps. So how does life for Americans change once the country officially enters World War II? We declare war on Japan in December of 1941, and in response, Germany will declare war on the United States because America was already supplying Lend-Lease to the British and the Soviets. Hitler wanted his U-boats to be able to attack more American shipping, so he will declare war on the U.S. So we're fighting a two-front war in the Atlantic and in Europe, and a war in the Pacific as well. And the American people and the American economy, as large and powerful as the American people and the economy are, they must mobilize for war. There must be a degree of central management, we'll say, to get the country ready. We're going to have to be even more mobilized than we were for World War I. At the same time, though, there also will be an increase in free market activity as well. Some of the more regulatory policies of the New Deal, some of the more anti-business policies, you might say, of the New Deal are going to have to be done away with in order for the U.S. economy to reach its best level of productivity. There will be management of the economy by the U.S. government, but there has to be free market competition and enterprise as well to produce the most supply possible. So Congress was controlled by conservatives who often sparred with FDR, but they went along with FDR in supporting tax increases and deficit spending to finance this war. The marginal tax rate was increased drastically up to 94%. It had been in the 70s during the Great Depression, but it was leveled at up to 94% on earners who made up to over 200,000 a year. That'd be about $3 million in today's money. Of course, the highest earners, many of them are involved with government contracts. They're doing a lot of war work. Many of them are making a lot of money during the war as well, thanks to government contracts. And there's always tax loopholes whenever there's tax increases. You definitely see that across time in American history. The poor and the middle class are also going to pay additional taxes as well. And this leads to the 1943 Current Tax Payment Act, which it creates the federal withholding system, which we see today on our paychecks. A certain amount of our tax, or a certain amount of our paycheck is withheld for tax because many Americans were not used to paying taxes. Only about 10% of the American population was paying tax in 1940, and it was a shock when they got their tax bill in April. So withholding was created to prevent this. Sometimes you have extra tax you still have to pay in April, but some Americans will get refunds in April. And only about 10% of Americans were paying taxes in 1940. Either they were unemployed or they weren't making enough money to have to pay. But by 1944, almost every American who was employed was paying income taxes. Wages and price controls are introduced as well as American civilians are increasing their labor hours. There are shortages of goods because we're shipping extra supply to our allies. And this is being done to support the war effort and to prevent price gouging. And World War II and the New Deal, in some ways, it's similar to progressivism in World War I. The New Dealers had more of an opportunity to centrally manage the economy, something that they'd wanted to do throughout the 1930s. Also, they get to increase taxes, something that they supported as well. At the same time, they have to make some compromises. Some alphabet soup New Deal programs like the CCC and the WPA are going to be shut down. That way, those workers can do war work or they can join the military. And also, the U.S. government has to develop a less adversarial relationship with big business leaders, people like Henry Kaiser and Henry Ford. They have to work with these people in order to supply war material to the U.S. war effort and to our allies. These are Henry Kaiser's Liberty ships. Henry Kaiser was a wealthy businessman who was based in San Francisco. And these Liberty ships, they were designed to be built very quickly. They were designed to be built by shipbuilders who did not have extensive experience building ships. And they were designed to be operated by crews that did not have extensive sailing experience. And over 2,700 were built, and they were kind of cramped, and they were often not very pleasant vessels to serve on, but they could be built so efficiently and quickly that they became kind of the workhorses of the American merchant marine effort, and, supplying our own troops and then supplying our allies, the Soviets and the British. And these Liberty ship projects, many of these jobs employed women and African Americans. And in fact, during World War II, if you wanted to receive government contracts, you had to employ African Americans. You couldn't just employ white workers. Here is a Henry Ford plant. The Ford Motor Company made tank engines. They made aircraft. These are B-17s. At the height of their production, at their most efficient point, they were turning out a new B-17 bomber about every hour. So massive mobilization, a partnership between the government and between business and between central management of the economy and private industry as well. And this put Americans back to work. It put more money into Americans' pockets. It was costly, though. Taxes had to be increased, and there was a massive increase to the U.S. national debt. But these efforts, they do get America out of the Great Depression. This gets our unemployment rates down to healthy economic levels by 1942. This is a big boy engine. It's a locomotive. They're much larger than the other trains that were being used during this period. These were important locomotives because they were powerful enough to pull heavier loads of military supply trains over the Rocky Mountains and over the the mountains in the Great Basin. This is essential that way because the United States in World War II were fighting a true front war in Europe and the Atlantic and in Asia and the Pacific. We have to be able to cross the United States and cross the mountain ranges in the Rockies and in the West. And the big boy engine is powerful enough to pull these heavier military supply trains. In World War I, we didn't have to worry about this because we were fighting primarily in Europe and across the Atlantic. But this is a multi-sea, multi-front war. This is a ration book and ration coupons, which you would use to purchase certain food items and other goods. This rationing was enacted to preserve scarce food products and to engage in fraud or in black market activities was a serious crime. You could face a 10-year prison sentence and a $10,000 fine. So rationing was taken very seriously in World War II. I'm going to discuss rationing a bit more on the next slide. The U.S. government is going to institute rationing in World War II. We did not do this in World War I. We regulated the food industry in World War I, but we did not ration food items. In June of 1942, the Combined Board of Food was established. Meat was rationed, sugar was rationed, certain dairy products could be rationed, and canned foods could be rationed as well. That way, more provisions could be exported to our allies. Gasoline and rubber tires were also rationed. Auto races like the Indy 500 were shut down. Driving for sightseeing was banned. Americans were encouraged to carpool to work and to use as little gas and as little rubber as possible. Children would look around for old tires to recycle, and supermarkets were around before World War II, but the idea of a self-service supermarket where you go and pick up the food yourself off the shelf, that really grows during World War II because supermarkets, they stopped making deliveries during the war. Again, supermarkets have been around before World War II, but the idea that you go get your groceries yourself, that was normalized during the Second World War. When you went to go buy goods, though, you were going to have to bring a ration book, and you have to use that to purchase certain goods. And the government also put in price controls to prevent items that you weren't, to prevent price gouging and things like that. People were also encouraged to be frugal and to consume less food and to find substitutes. Americans were encouraged to do things like have meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays and to make recipes with substitute ingredients. That way more food could be shipped to our allies across the world in Europe and also to China as well. China also participated in programs like Lend-Lease, for example. Some items like automobiles, new cars, and home appliances basically were unavailable during the war because manufacturers were making war supplies and war material and weapons. And as a result of this rationing and as a result of price controls, Americans were making more money than ever before. Americans were saving much of the money they made because there's really very little for you to spend on. And pay on the whole went up during the war as a result of government spending and labor shortage. Labor shortages brought on by the drafting of so many working age American men. The question some scholars ask is, was all this rationing and management of the economy really necessary? Scholars debate this. They generally agree that the American economy was powerful enough that it didn't really need all this rationing. Our economy was more powerful and producing more GDP than all the other belligerents combined in World War II. But this rationing does two things. One, it helps to organize scarce resources. Even if you have enough resources, you have to be able to get them to the people who need them. And rationing and this management of the economy helps make that possible. And the second thing is this rationing, this control of these industries, it really makes the war real for everyday American civilians who are not fighting in the war. Perhaps they have a son or a father who's fighting, but it really makes them feel the war and it makes them want to do their part to support the war effort. This is a period of higher social trust in American society, and the American people are wanting to come together to support a common goal. Here are a few more stats about the U.S. economy in World War II. Unemployment drops to pre-1929 levels in 1942. It's going to reach an all-time low in 1944, with only about 700,000 employable Americans being out of work out of 135 million people. The government also encourages Americans to put their savings back into the war effort by purchasing government bonds, which will mature over time and can be cashed out once the war is over. All in all, nearly three-quarters of the American GDP, about 74%, was tied to producing war supplies. And the U.S. government spends about $4.5 trillion in today's money on this war. And by 1944, U.S. economic output was greater than all the other belligerents combined. And people used to say during the period and after that World War I was won by three American generals: General Mills, General Electric, and General Motors. It's also worth noting that GM, like Ford, kept their plants open in Nazi Germany as well. And Stalin said in 1943 at the Tehran Conference, World War II is going to be won with British brains, American steel, and Soviet blood. And now we'll talk a bit more about American civilians and the American population as a whole during World War II. Women, children, um, ethnic and racial minority groups as well. And this is a family working on a victory garden at home. Grow more food for yourself so you don't have to buy as much from the supermarket, and more can be shipped abroad. And then images of Rosie the Riveter, American women working in factories and working in munitions plants, doing jobs that were previously done by men. That way more men could serve in the U.S. war effort. The U.S. government appeals to the patriotism of Americans of all backgrounds. Men who are not drafted, they could volunteer to serve in the military. Eventually, what happens is conscription becomes more universal. Um, you'll have to basically be drafted in order to serve in the military. And women will join the military as well, although they'll generally serve in non-combat roles as secretaries, drivers, nurses, radio operators, and in some cases as pilots as well, although they're going to serve as pilots in non-combat positions. And women are also going to enter the workforce in greater numbers, taking jobs that had previously been done by men. Gender norms often change during warfare. You see this across time. Heavy manufacturing and agriculture and other industries are going to be more women are going to move into these roles, and even things like women's fashion are going to change because of women working outside of the home in larger numbers and because of the wartime shortages. For example, women's skirts and dresses will become shorter because of fabric shortages. Men's clothing also will become tighter as well because of these fabric shortages. They also will add shoulder pads to women's blouses and coats as well. We think this was done to make women look more muscular and powerful as they're working outside of the home in greater numbers. You see this in the 1980s too, actually. Women are also going to stop wearing silk stockings. Um, that fabric is needed to make things like parachutes. And women also will wear trousers or pants more frequently because they're working in factories, they're working in weapons plants, and they need to be able to move more easily and be more mobile. Um, Even though there is some more androgynous changes to women's fashion, at the same time, women are still encouraged, and some might even say pressured, to express their femininity and perhaps even their sexuality in fashion. The male gaze is something that is still a concern for many women in this period. So that's an area where society in World War II is different than today. And for example, women still wear elaborate hairstyles like the victory roll. It's designed to frame the face, and it looks like a little bit like a V. I'll show some pictures on another slide. Women are also encouraged to wear makeup, especially red lipstick, because it's red lipstick, white teeth. It's like red, white, and blue. And they're encouraged to look good for their men, for their husbands, their sons, their fathers. And that's part of supporting the war effort, is looking good for the men in their lives. Women questioned whether they should save more resources by, for example, not wearing makeup anymore. And they were encouraged to continue to wear it as a way to show their patriotism, and also to show that while America was engaging in rationing, and our economy was being centrally managed, we still had a lot more supplies, and we still had certain luxuries and conveniences that our allies in Britain and the Soviet Union did not have because their economies are much more damaged by German bombings and German invasions. So we're also trying to show our prosperity as well. There are caveats, though, with this. Although the war does change women's fashion and does lead to some changes in gender roles, women never exceed more than 30% of the out-of-home labor force. And after the war, many women are going to face pressure to quit the jobs that they took on during the war to make room for returning male veterans. Children and teenagers, they also their number of children and teenagers are also going to take on more work during World War II as well, even though their employment numbers had gone down during the Great Depression so that more adults could work. That's going to change during World War II. Young children are going to grow victory gardens at home. They're going to collect scrap metal. Teenagers are going to work part-time in retail establishments. That way, more adults can serve in the military, and they themselves can serve in the military once they are of age. Here are some images related to women's effort in the American home front. This is the famous "We Can Do It" poster. Sometimes it's erroneously called the Rosie the Riveter poster. This is probably the most famous poster of a woman from World War II, and it's associated with the modern feminist movement as well. It actually was a fairly unknown poster. It was just in some Westinghouse factories during the war, but now it's iconic today. But women were encouraged to get jobs, whether it's directly in the U.S. military or even in civilian manufacturing. They're adopting, new hairstyles like the victory roll as well to show their patriotism. And jobs, if they were accepting government contracts, they had to be integrated for both white women and black women to receive jobs. And women's fashion changes as a result of World War II. Skirts and dresses and coats become shorter. This is to save cloth that can be made into uniforms and it is needed for equipment. We also see that shoulder pads become a bit broader to make women look more muscular, more powerful, highlighting their increased labor outside of the home. And as I mentioned before, stockings fall out of favor to save resources. And there was a pressure, I would say, on women to uh, look good for men, which some people might take issue with today, but that was more a part of the culture in World War II and in the 1940s. World War II opened up new opportunities for African Americans, similar to World War I, but I think World War II did this in a much more extensive way. It's an opportunity to have better jobs and better wages, to move to industrial centers like Detroit, for example, and to work for equal rights. African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, they will support the Double V campaign. Um, we're going to have victory against fascism abroad, and we're going to have a victory for equality and democracy at home. African American leaders wisely recognize that they need to associate their community's activism with patriotism and with loyalty to America, while also highlighting the sacrifices that black people were making for the American war effort. In previous years, African Americans, when they protested for equality, unfortunately, they were associated with being enemies of the United States, even with possibly being communists and socialists, even if they weren't actually socialists or communists. And black leaders wanted to prevent this from happening. They wanted to show that they were on the same side as white Americans. They did not want to be seen as the enemy within. Um, they want to avoid wartime domestic suppression. And there were some race riots in the Second World War, especially in Detroit, as black workers were coming up into the city to take on jobs at the auto plants that are making war supplies. Some white Americans were upset about this and did not want black people to come into the city. But generally speaking, I would say that race relations improved during World War II. Um, Americans of all races had a common goal, a common external enemy, and opportunities opened up for African Americans in civilian manufacturing. Um, there cannot be racial discrimination in government work projects. Those workplaces have to be integrated. And African Americans also have the opportunity to show their patriotism in the military as well. Although, again, as was the case in World War One, African American units were largely segregated, and African American units also generally did not see as much combat because there were white American military leaders who still believed that African Americans could not be good soldiers. There were exceptions like the Red Tails of the Tuskegee Institute, the Tuskegee Airmen, they're often called. They served with distinction as pilots and bombardiers and ground crew for the Army, basically for the U.S. Army's Air Force, what eventually will become the U.S. Air Force. And they showed that they could be just as good of soldiers as white men. And unfortunately, black servicemen did report experiencing racial discrimination. This was especially true for black men who perhaps were born and raised in the North, and then they were sent to the South for military training on their way out of the country. They were witnessing the Jim Crow system for the first time and segregation for the first time, but their honorable service in the country does provide an impetus for desegregation of the military in the years following World War II. Here are some images related to African Americans' service to the country during World War II, both military service and service in civilian manufacturing. United we win, as this poster on the bottom left says. This is the Double V campaign, victory at home and abroad. This is Dory Miller, who received the Navy Cross for his service at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. Both black men and black women took on civilian manufacturing jobs that supported the war effort. And here are the Tuskegee Airmen, including a buy war bonds poster that targets African American bond buyers. Native Americans also served in the U.S. military in World War II and in civilian jobs as well. About 44 to 45,000 joined the U.S. military. Native Americans could now be drafted because they'd been citizens since 1924. They actually had a lower draft deferment rate than other populations, and high numbers served in the defense industries as well. So in spite of the wars that the U.S. had fought against Native American powers, they served in great numbers in the U.S. Military. Good examples are Ira Hayes of the Pima people. He assisted in the famous flag raising at Mount Suribachi de Iwo Jima. He was part of the U.S. Marine Corps. You also have, beneath that image, the Navajo code talkers who, like the Choctaw had in World War I, they used their native language to develop codes for the Marine Corps. The Japanese were not able to crack the codes that were based on the Navajo language. The Japanese knew English, but they didn't know the Navajo language, which was very, very different than different to English and different to Japanese. And Native American women also assisted in the war effort as well. Most notably, Eva Mirabal of the Taos Pueblo people who made art, including comic strips for the Women's Auxiliary. Now we'll talk about Latinos in the U.S. military. I don't have as good of statistics for how many Latinos served in the U.S. Armed Forces. I've seen numbers as low as 350,000, and I've seen numbers as high as 600,000. This number is rough because the military did not classify Latinos as Latino. They were classified as white if they had a lighter complexion, or they could be classified as black if they had a darker complexion. We can look at people's last names and then we can kind of extrapolate based on that information. In addition, the U.S. also increased in immigration from Latin America into the United States. You see this with the Bracero program from 1942 to 1964. It lasted even after the war. Bracero in Spanish, it means like strong arms or a manual laborer. These were Mexican guest workers who worked especially in agriculture, and then Americans, native-born Americans, could then move into industrial jobs or into the military. So overall, U.S.-Latino relations do generally improve because of World War II. There are exceptions, though, most notably the Zoot Suit riots of June 1943. LA had a large Mexican and Mexican American population, and what you might also call a Chicano, Latino Southwestern population as well. And Latino men in LA, they like to wear what was called the zoot suit. It's a suit that's a long, baggy jacket with baggy pants with tight cuffs. And they usually have bright colors and bright patterns. And it's designed to give a distinctive look and to signal sort of um, what you might call Latino diasporate culture or local Southwestern Latino culture. It's a distinctive look from what an Anglo-American would wear because everyday men they wear suits. When they're not if they're not doing like manual labor, just if you're going out around the town, you wear a suit. That's the way it was back then. There's also some African American and even an Italian American influence in the zoot suit style. You wear it with gold chains and fancy leather-soled shoes, and it's a little bit of conspicuous consumption. And some might even say there's a bit of an overlap between zoot suit style and like 1920s gang culture. So when white American servicemen, sailors, Marines, soldiers, when they're in LA awaiting deployment to the Pacific, they see Latino men in the zoot suit. Perhaps it's the first time they've seen Hispanic people. Perhaps it's the first time they've heard Spanish spoken. Many of them do get upset and they associate the zoot suit with anti-Americanism. The zoot suits, they have a lot more fabric than the standard suit worn by white Americans. They're seen as wasteful and skirting wartime regulations about cloth rationing. Because usually, if you're buying a zoot suit, you have to buy it from like an underground tailor, not from just a regular clothing store. And so it's seen as being unpatriotic, it's seen as being different, and there is, perhaps an element of racism. This is what the other wears. And so the immediate causes of the riot, scholars disagree, but what happens is the riots escalate quickly as mostly white servicemen begin to get into fights with the Zoot Suiters, and there's fights on the streets of LA. Um, the Zoot Suiters would be attacked by the servicemen who would rip off their suits. They also didn't like the fact that the Zoot Suiters often had longer, sort of slick back hairstyles, whereas the servicemen had, like shorter military haircuts too. So they're also seen as kind of breaking the gender norms of the period as well, in addition to being unpatriotic and being a racial other. In the end, about 500 Zoot Suiters are arrested, but the U.S. Servicemen, they're not arrested. They're just sent back to their bases and sequestered there. So the U.S. government wanted to stop this racial violence because it looks bad. It makes America look divided, and it makes America not look morally, doesn't make us look moral. And it played into the Axis's desires to weaken and divide America. So this is the Zoot Suit Riot of 1943. And here are some images of the Zoot Suit riots. These are young Latino men wearing zoot suits. As you can see, it's a baggier style, and it's worn with slick back hair. Um, um, you take a picture in front of an automobile. It's conspicuous consumption, something that white Americans traditionally have not liked very much, conspicuous consumption. And when the servicemen saw this, they began to attack the Zoot Suiters, and about 500 of the Zoot Suiters were arrested, although the American servicemen were just sent back to their bases, and then they were deployed out to the Pacific. And we can't talk about American domestic mobilization and um, race relations in America in World War II without talking about Japanese Americans in World War II and topics like Japanese internment. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the loss of the Philippines, U.S. intelligence discovered that Japanese nationals in the Philippines and some Japanese people in Hawaii had aided the Japanese military, providing intel and things of that nature. In response, President Roosevelt ordered that all people of Japanese descent to the third generation who were living in the West Coast, they would be removed and sequestered. Italian and German nationals could also be sequestered as well, but only Italian and German nationals, not someone of Italian or German ancestry. This is not just people born in Japan, but people who are U.S. born of Japanese ancestry. So there is a racial element to this. Um, The Japanese people of Hawaii, though, were not largely not included. They were basically left on the Hawaiian Islands. And the U.S. never invaded the Japanese mainland, but the fear was that if they did invade the U.S. mainland, these Japanese people might rise up and join the Japanese invasion, which the Japanese looked down on Japanese people that were born outside of the country, the Nisei. So there wasn't really a good reason to believe this, that they just extrapolated this based on a few Japanese people in America that had supported espionage efforts. As I said, Japanese Americans living in Hawaii and the East Coast were generally not evacuated or forced out of their homes. Instead, they would basically be forced out of certain zones where they lived, and they'd be observed and tracked and things like that. The largest Japanese community in America was actually in Hawaii. It was about 150,000, and they were largely allowed to stay where they were. Um, and white Americans were very divided over the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans. Some thought this was the right thing to do, others did not think so. Um, basically at the time, people felt that there was racism against Japanese people in America. Many felt that this was a necessary thing to be done to prevent possible subversion or espionage. But at the same time, again, the United States is trying to show its moral superiority to the Axis, that we're better than the Axis. Yet we're sending, in some cases, our own citizens to internment camps, which in some ways they function a lot like German concentration camps. Now, they're not nearly as bad as German concentration camps, and they were not built to exterminate Japanese people, but there is racial profiling going on. There is imprisonment without probable cause going on here for sure. Um, in spite of this racial profiling that the Japanese and Japanese American people were subject to, many do volunteer for service in the U.S. military, including Daniel Inouye. He was a Japanese American man from Hawaii who served with distinction in Europe. Um, and I will say that many other Japanese and Japanese American men, some of whom had been in these camps, do join the U.S. military. Generally, they're deployed in Europe, not in the Pacific. Democratic President Jimmy Carter ordered an investigation of the internment in 1980, and in 1888, Republican President Ronald Reagan authorized payouts of $20,000, or about $40,000 in today's money, to Japanese Americans who had been interred. And there were over 140,000 that were interned in these camps, but about 80,000 were around in 1988 to collect these payouts of about $1.6 billion. And it doesn't make it right. These camps were not nice places to be, and many Japanese people had to sell their homes and their cars and their businesses very quickly, often at fire sale rates, before they were sent to these camps. This is Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, who served in the U.S. Army in Europe. He was wounded and actually lost an arm and received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service. And while he was not in an internment camp, he was aware of these camps, and he witnessed one in Arkansas on his way to serve in Europe. This is actor George Takei. He's the younger child in this picture. He was actually detained in several internment camps as a child during the war, and I got to hear him speak about his experiences a couple of years ago at a Star Trek convention, which was really interesting to hear. He was an actor on Star Trek, the original series. And these are other images of the Japanese internment camps. Some of them were in nicer places than others, and the people in these camps, the Japanese and Japanese Americans, some of them were very angry about being interned, and they condemned the United States for sending them there. Others looked to overcome this prejudice, and some joined the U.S. military or served in essential industries and got out of the camps. This is the Korematsu v. U.S. case of 1944. It was a landmark Supreme Court case in which Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American from California, he sued the U.S. government, claiming that his Fifth Amendment rights had been violated, that he was being discriminated against because of his Japanese heritage. And the case went to the Supreme Court. The majority opinion was written by Justice Hugo Black, who had been a former KKK member. He declared that the internment of Japanese Americans was not done out of racial prejudice; it was done out of military considerations. Even though you know German and Italian Americans were not sent to camps, and he was arguing that Korematsu's rights had not been violated. This was a military necessity, and therefore it was acceptable. And it's considered to be one of the worst decisions made by the U.S. Supreme Court. So, how did the U.S. government mobilize the American people to support the draft, to grow victory gardens, to work extra hours, to buy bonds, or even to accept things like Japanese internment? Well, the U.S. ran a massive, sophisticated, and diverse propaganda campaign that included many different types of media to get the public to support the war. American propagandists created media to motivate Americans to enlist in the military, join civilian war support organizations, and to accept the government restrictions and rations that had been put on most goods. Um, Propagandists also sought to create animus against the Axis powers, especially Germany and Japan. And as they had in World War I, the U.S. government hired artists to compose propaganda posters that implored Americans to buy war bonds, grow victory gardens, recycle, even things like use protection during sexual intercourse. Um, and the U.S. government also released images to try to build affinity for the Russians in the minds of the Americans, as well as for the Chinese, because anti-Russian and anti-communist sentiment had been common in America in the 1920s and 30s. But now the Russians are our allies. The Chinese, who had been banned from the country, they are now our allies as well. And the U.S. government is going to use new media technologies that were either not available during the First World War or were just not as significant. Motion pictures are much bigger in the 1940s thanks to sound recording and integration. The U.S. government will release training films, both live action and cartoon, to bolster American support for the war, and these are sometimes educational videos as well. And Hollywood will work alongside the U.S. government. It will have its scripts approved by the U.S. government, and the U.S. government controls the flow of information that's coming out of the battlefronts. It's going to be, in some ways, you could say, censored before it makes its way to the American people to keep the American public supportive of the war effort, to really hide the violence and carnage of the war. And filmmakers and actors largely support the war effort. They want to continue to be able to make films and not be shut down. Artists even experiment in other types of media like comic books. Comic books that had grown in popularity in the 1930s, and they're going to use existing characters to encourage patriotism as well as new characters to inspire patriotism. So, Marvel Comics will create Captain America in March of 1941. This is actually before America enters the war. We don't enter until December of 41. But DC Comics' Superman was created in 1938. He's going to fight the Axis during the war years. And there's been a lot of really interesting work done recently about comic books and mobilization and propaganda. I actually chaired a panel at a recent history conference in 2024 that talked about comic books and patriotism in World War II America. Here are posters designed to motivate the American people. They target men and women, and young men who can serve in the military, as well as older men as well. They're saying, older men, your service to the country domestically is just as important as the young men's service in uniform. Um, Men who work in factories, riveting together Liberty ships, their service is just as important as soldiers operating machine guns. Women um, serve as nurses, serve in the women's auxiliary. Children, encourage your parents to buy war bonds, deliver us from evil. This is very biblical language. And then this image here is designed to encourage Americans to think of the Russians, the Soviets, as your allies. It's a smiling Soviet soldier. This man is your friend. He fights for freedom. He is our ally, and we're going to support him with Lend-Lease. Here are some other media images from the World War II period. Adult media and children's media featured inspiration from the war effort and showed patriotic characters like Captain America fighting Hitler. I know several years ago in a comic they had Captain America become a Nazi, and that really angered a lot of people. And this is why, because Captain America was created to fight Hitler and the Nazis. Superman here is fighting Hitler and Tojo. Even Daffy Duck and Popeye the Sailor, they get in on the action of fighting the Axis. And this is from one of my favorite wartime Looney Tunes cartoons called The Commando. And there are some racial themes and racist themes that come up in their portrayal of the Japanese. So that's something to be aware of if you're going to look up any of these cartoons or comics. Before I show a few more images of propaganda posters, I want to talk about the contents of these posters and how this stuff was received and why it was successful in the 1940s United States. These propaganda campaigns, they were initiated by the U.S. government in partnership with the media. They were designed to galvanize the American people and even unite Americans from a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds. And this was an era of higher social trust than nowadays. This era of social trust, I've said it before, I think it begins in about the mid 1920s and it intensifies during the New Deal era, thanks to the efforts of the U.S. government. The American people had suffered so much during the Depression, and they now had a common foe they wanted to work against. And so these campaigns were successful. I would say they were more successful. They would not have been nearly as successful if they were being done in 2020's America. There is a dark side, though, to these propaganda campaigns. You have to mobilize the American people against something. So, anti-Nazi propaganda often portrays the Germans as thoughtless, ignorant martinets who followed Hitler's every order, and they often feature ethnic slurs against Germans. And Hitler is portrayed as being a bumbling buffoon and an idiot, and the Germans, though, while they're portrayed badly, they're not really portrayed as a racial other in the way they were in World War I, where the Germans were almost portrayed as being not white, you could say. However, there is racist imagery that comes up in the portrayals of the Japanese, and I alluded to this before. The Japanese people were portrayed both in images and in film as being shorter and weaker than people of European descent, as being racially inferior. They wanted to show the Japanese as having weak eyesight, wearing thick, round glasses that they couldn't see properly because of the way their eyes were shaped. These are, racist tropes that there was no rational reason to believe, but it gave the American people an opportunity to see the Japanese as different than themselves. Oddly enough, though, they also had this myth of Japanese invincibility, that the Japanese were subhuman, but they were impossible to defeat. They were just so tough. They were too tough. They also show the Japanese with like overbites and unkempt mustaches, really dehumanizing stuff to make them look frightening and uncivilized and subhuman. I think especially to children that would see these posters or watch these films. And this propaganda also features racial slurs of the Japanese people as well, referring to them as JAPS. You know what that spells. I don't think it's something you can say on YouTube. And films and cartoons, they show the Japanese as dangerous barbarians, dastardly villains, who will hurt women and children, particularly white women if given the chance, which the Japanese did do that. They did hurt civilians and women and non-combatants, including white American people in the Philippines. At the same time, though, they also portray the Japanese as being foolish and easily tricked and weaker than white Americans, and as overly obsequious and overly polite and overly obsessed with manners and just not like red-blooded democratic, frontier Americans. Not like our superheroes and our cartoon characters that will outwit and defeat the Japanese. And overall, the U.S. government did have an office of censorship that could censor media deemed harmful to the war effort. American soldiers' letters home could be censored as well. They'd be steamed open and parts would be blacked out. They even had to train American servicemen to accept this for safety reasons. But generally, the American media towed the line. They went along with these propaganda campaigns and with censorship. These are some propaganda posters related to the U.S. war effort, and they cast the Germans in a very negative light. This image on the left shows the Germans surrendering. We beat them once in World War I. We'll do it again in World War II. Here is a propaganda poster encouraging Americans to carpool. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Save gas and carpool today. This one here shows the Germans stabbing the Bible. It is true that the Nazis were not supportive of Christianity. Hitler did not like Christianity, and they're playing to Americans' um, desire to preserve their faith. The four freedoms: freedom of religion, something that the Nazis did not support. And this is an image showing Hitler playing with his toy soldiers, his martinettes. He's a silly child, but he's going to be defeated by the United States Army Air Force. Here are images related to the portrayal of the Japanese in American media propaganda. They're portrayed in a very racist manner. There are stereotypes, but even things that don't exist in reality. The Japanese are portrayed with subhuman, almost animal features, not real things at all, but they're portrayed as being violent, as being very aggressive, particularly sexually aggressive towards women, which there are things like mass SAs that took place under the Japanese. Those events did happen, and that they play to Americans' gender anxieties and fear that women will be attacked. Other ways they're portrayed as being overly obsequious and being very, very hardworking. That the Japanese are almost like machines or like insects. They will work much harder than Americans, so you Americans need to work longer hours. Don't take a day off. We need to work as hard or harder than the Japanese. And they're portrayed speaking broken English, as you can see on this slide, and um, this it stands in contrast to how the Chinese, other East Asian people, are portrayed. The Chinese are our friends and our allies, even though the Chinese have been banned from coming into America since the 1880s. And it's actually in 1943 that the Chinese will allow to again come to the United States. And the image you see on this slide is of a Chinese soldier, specifically a nationalist KMT Chinese soldier. The nationalists were led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese communists, who also fought the Japanese, they were led by Mao Zedong of the Chinese Communist Party. Before we begin closing out this video, I want to talk a little bit about propaganda posters, both in the present, in the 2020s, and in the World War II era. Back during the 2020 pandemic, artists from across the U.S. made some World War II style, even some World War I style propaganda posters. The World War I style posters, I haven't seen as many of them, but they're actually a lot more apropos because of when the Spanish flu hit the world. But the World War II ones are much more familiar to the average American. And I remember seeing them, and they didn't sit very well with me. And I couldn't quite figure it out at the time. And I don't think they really landed very well with the American public writ large, people I talked with who saw them. And I'm not getting into a critique of the pandemic response. But what I will do is I'll talk about why I think this media campaign didn't work. First, propaganda to be successful, it has to play to our emotions, our primal feelings of anger, love, sexual attraction, anxieties about gender relations, a bit more complex, higher level thinking, in-group preferences, a bit more higher level thinking, but the primal emotions and then the thinking that's a little bit higher up as well, those emotions have to be manipulated and mobilized. And the thing is, mobilizing and manipulating those kind of emotions is not acceptable in 2020's culture. It's seen as manipulative. manipulative, and even dangerous. You look at the intense emotions that happened later in 2020 in response to other events, and people are concerned about strong emotion in America, especially the emotion of anger and fear. So in these posters, emotions are not nearly as strong, and they're not used in the same way. And in-group, out-group preference, having an external enemy to fight, you don't have them in these 2020 posters. You don't have in this Give 'em Hell poster on the left, you see an American soldier bayoneting Hitler and Mussolini. You don't have anything like that in the posters I've seen from 2020. And you really shouldn't expect to see that sort of thing. And on the note of primal emotions as well, people during the pandemic wore masks to try to prevent the spread of COVID. In some cases, were legally required to do so, and that was a very divisive thing. And I think seeing, someone wearing a mask, whether it's in your daily life or in media, it almost short circuits your brain. It's confusing to the eye. We read emotions by looking at the faces of other people. It's how we sense friendship or danger, and it suddenly becomes much more difficult to do that. You really can only do it with the eyes, with less than half of the face. Although eyes are important. Eyes are the window to the soul, as they say. Um, and so you don't have that sort of thing, faces being covered up in the posters from World War II. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see a version, or what you might call a parody, of the famous Westinghouse "We Can Do It" poster. Well, it's famous today, but it wasn't famous during the war. But it doesn't really sit with you the same way. With the subject, her face being largely covered, one can recognize the importance of wearing face masks. Whether you think that that was the right thing to do or not in the pandemic, I'm not getting into, but it's not going to have the same emotional effect on you, the viewer. And the last thing is, pandemic guidance was always changing. At certain points, we were told, don't wear masks to save PPE for healthcare workers and first responders. Other times, people were told, or in some cases even legally required, to wear masks once supply chains had caught up with the increased need and demand for such goods. So guidance changing, it was more clear who the enemy was and what needed to be done in World War II, as opposed to not knowing if you have to do something different a week or a month from now. And then the final reason why I don't think these campaigns, why I think they were not really congruent, and why they were even a bit anachronistic and almost kitschy, is Americans in the present, and this would go the same for 2020, is we live in a society where social trust, both socially, of our neighbors and of institutions, is far lower than it was in the 1940s. And I'm not just saying that. There is a lot of data, very robust data to back that up, which I'm going to go over in our videos about post-World War II America. So for propaganda to work, you have to mistrust someone, but you have to have trust in the people around you as well. And that's not something that was around in 2020 America in the way it was in 1945 America, what would have been 75 years earlier. And then the final thing is, America's attitudes towards propaganda is much more negative. Propaganda is a dirty word nowadays, for many reasons, many of which are very good, and it's right that Americans are concerned about this kind of mobilization. We're turned off to propaganda, or at least we think we're turned off to propaganda. The obvious, unsubtle propaganda that's government sponsored, we're very against, but there's propaganda all around us. It's just coming from different sources, and we often don't realize it. But that's all I'm going to say on this matter. This is just something to think about. You may have very different ideas about the pandemic or about these media campaigns, and that's fine. But it's an area where there's similarities and differences with the past, change over time, and that's the heart of what history is. But now we're going to get on to our conclusion. Conclusion, to wrap up this first video in my two-part mini-series on the United States in World War II. World War I officially begins in 1939. The U.S. does not enter the war until late 1941. But World War II doesn't come out of nowhere. There were signs of a future conflict in the 1930s and even as early as the 1920s with the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe, and then, of course, the rise of totalitarianism in Asia as well. And during this period in the 1920s and the 1930s, and even after the war fully begins in 1939, the U.S. prefers a more non-interventionist stance to focus on domestic problems related to the Great Depression and to do things differently than how the U.S. had done things with imperial foreign policy in the turn of the century years. But after 1939, as the war escalates, U.S. leaders, most notably President Franklin D. Roosevelt, they saw the war as an opportunity to strengthen the American economy and to transform the United States into the arsenal of democracy via things like the Lend-Lease program, where we supplied weaponry to Great Britain and then eventually to the Soviet Union and the nationalists of China. And America will officially enter the war in December of 1941, but we've been supporting the Allies against the Axis for over a year with supplies and with weapons and things of this nature. And during World War II, the American people and the American home front will be heavily mobilized, and I would argue very effectively mobilized as well. About 3/4 of our GDP will go to war production, and nearly all employable Americans will have jobs. Full employment had been a New Deal goal, actually, along with things like tax increases and central management of the economy. So there are certain New Deal goals that are realized by World War II. But they also have to make some concessions as well, particularly towards private business. They have to adopt a more pro-business stance to work with people like Henry J. Kaiser to build Liberty ships, for example. Something similar happened in World War I with the progressives. The progressives, they got to mobilize society in a way that they had always wanted to do, but they also had to be more friendly with big business as well in order to arm America. You see a similar pattern in World War II. And there are extensive mobilization and propaganda campaigns in the United States, like this WPA poster here. The WPA was eventually closed down, though, during World War II. That way, more workers could be in war industries and could directly serve in the military. There is, of course, a negative side to this mobilization, though. There are portrayals of the Japanese in media that we would consider to be very racist and inappropriate today, but were seen as being necessary at the time. And we're more in line with the period's ideas about race, and also the internment of Japanese Americans, a subject that was controversial in the 1940s and remains so to this day. But our next video is going to be more of a operational military history of the war. How did the U.S. actually fight in World War II?